financially. There was actually a story, one of the bishops or one of the priests, they were going to give Martin Luther a wedding present of money, and he was going to refuse it because by giving him that money, then he was going to owe a favor to that priest or bishop. And when his wife heard about it, she went to him and said, "Certainly we will take that." So she knew how to manage money well. So when I learned that, I figured, well, a Reformation tour on stewardship will work just fine. I would also like to thank Elder Corridon and Robert Wagley and Rhonda Carr for the privilege of coming back here. It's kind of like coming home. I pastored in this conference when my daughter was at least 3 years old, and so we know a number of people here, and it's good to be here. And I hope you have a good rest of the camp meeting. I've been on the road for a little over a week and a half, and it's time for me to go home. And I can't wait to be there. I'd like to share with you just a few, at least two little commercials. You can see this little book. Some of these are on the chairs, and they had them on the chairs last night. Here's how this book works. And you can get these from Advent Source if you like. This is 7 great facts about 7 different topics within the realm of stewardship. So you just open it up to number 4. It says the offering. And you'll find that it talks about the offering. There's 7 points. So 7 great facts, and then there's 7 points. And it's very simple. It has a statement. Sometimes it's a question, sometimes it's just a statement. Number 1, the offering is a part of the redemptive process. That's a pretty heavy statement when you start thinking about it. When you give your offering, is that part of the redemptive process? There's a Bible text, and in some situations, some places, there is a Spirit of Prophecy quotation. So what you can do is you can say to the pastor, I would like for you to preach a series of 7 sermons and use this as the text. Now, obviously, a preacher is not going to preach a 7-point sermon. He might pick 1 or 2, at the most, maybe 3 points. And at the end of that 7 sermon series, then you could give this to every person in the local church. And they can use this for devotionals, to think and ponder about these topics. Stewardship, ownership, Sabbath, tithes, selfishness, sacrifice, offering, and covenant. So it's just a resource that you can use. It's designed to even slip in a coat pocket. And then I would like to share with you one other resource, and the box is right down here. Obviously, you've heard me talk about Stewardship Jack. This is a kit. So over the past 5 years, we've developed a variety of resources, and so we've tried to put them all inside a kit. You can get this from Advent Source. So I want to share with you what's in the kit. Here's a book. This is a 13-week children's church. It's designed to be used for children's church. You could use it in the evening during an evangelistic meeting for the kids. You could use it as a Sabbath school curriculum. A couple of years ago, they did this for the junior department at the SoCal camp meeting in California. So it's designed for juniors and primaries. Everything is right here. It tells you how to build the backdrop. It's based on about a 70-minute program, but you can cut and paste and make it as short or longer as you want. So it's very, very well designed and detailed. Then there is a songbook that goes with it. And I want to play for you just a portion of one of the songs. You get the idea? I wrote this song because when I was a kid growing up, my dad was a preacher, and it seemed like Sabbath morning was the most chaotic day of the week because I didn't want to get up, I didn't want to get dressed, I just was a kid. And have you ever been there? And pretty soon you say, can't we just have a nice Sabbath? So I was thinking about this, and so you can play this with, this is the piano music, or you can play it with a guitar, and you can make hundreds of rounds with this because you can say, hey, preacher, are you ready for Sabbath school? Hey, mom and dad, are you ready for Sabbath school? And you can just go on and on and on. So I thought if you get the kids coming to Sabbath school, you're probably going to get the parents. So we wrote that song. And there's some other songs in here that we've written. So it comes with a CD. So you have piano music, a CD, and there's the background tracks here so kids can learn this and sing it at church. To go along with the children's church, here are messages from Mr. Wright. Here are some Stewardship Jack and Friends videos. These are puppets, and they talk about principles of stewardship, getting out of debt, materialism. And then there are master files where at the end of your program, you can print out a newspaper and give it to the child as they leave. So it's a pretty much self-contained children's church. There's a director's manual for the children's church, and in the kit, there is a coloring book. Now, you can buy all these things separately, and you can buy this separately, and when you go to church board meeting and you get bored, then you can have a coloring book that you can color in. And this is not just page after page of pictures to color, there's some stories that go with it. And so it's been received quite well. Just thought I would share that with you. Just a couple of other things here. I talked about the bookmarks, tithe calculators, and there is even a offering envelope with Stewardship Jack on the front. And you have his logo on the back. And this follows the personal giving plan that the North American Division encourages church members to participate in. I thought I'd just share that with you. I want to look at the power of giving this morning. The power of giving can change the world. It can change your life, and it can change the lives of others. So what is the power of giving? We've talked about the pain of giving. I got about halfway through the pleasure of giving, and I'll share a couple of stories this morning that talk about the pleasure of giving. But I want to talk about the power of giving. Look at this. This is a map of the world, and the red-looking color, United States, Canada, and Australia, that color represents where people give the most. So this whole map looks at where people give. Now, if you go to a website, Global Tithe Index, you will find where they have studied the giving of Seventh-day Adventists all over the world. And they try to level the playing field. Where are the most faithful Adventists living that participate in tithe and offerings? And a few years ago, if I'm just remembering this off the top of my head, the United States was about number 42 out of 140 countries as being the most faithful. Canada was number 41. Now, when you return offerings and give offerings to the church there, that money doesn't belong to the church, it belongs to the state because Canada is a socialist country. And the state gives the church permission to distribute that money. So it's a different type of organization. Here is the staggering thing. This comes from a book called Passing the Plate. Let's just take the United States. If the Christian world in the United States, and these figures are coming from the Christian world and we are not included in the research. if the Christian world in the United States just averaged 10%, that means not all people that return tithes and offerings in the Christian world have to participate. Just average 10%. It would eradicate poverty and world hunger, period, overnight. That is absolutely staggering. Just averaged. When you start looking at this topic, not only has the Christian world fallen off the wagon, we have fallen off the wagon. And I know you might be thinking, John, you're preaching to the choir. This is the best of the best that come to camp meeting. Yes, that is true. But sometimes the choir needs to practice a little bit. Because you're going to have an influence on people when you go back. Because you're probably leaders in your local church. If we could get our own people to catch the vision. Let me just go out on a limb here. This is my opinion. This little offering envelope, you open it up, it says tithe. We understand that. Then it has offerings. And the offerings then list local church, conference, world mission. Did you know that's theologically incorrect? And if you look at your tithe envelope, it'll say that. Local church, conference, world mission. It's theologically incorrect. What should it be then? If you and I believe in a message that is to go to the world, we would have our tithe. Then what comes next should be world missions, conference, local offerings. The research says if you give to something bigger than yourself, you will have more money locally. So I've had young people say, well, we support that mission church over in another part of the world. I said, yes, but that's not big enough. You understand what I'm saying? To take this message that Dean's talking about, that these different seminar people are talking about, to the entire world, you can't get your mind around it, but that's what we're after. That's bigger than any mission trip that I can go on, and I've been on them, and as good as they are. But I decided, I've talked about this to some of my colleagues, I decided I don't want to die on that hill right there to try to change the tithe envelope. But I would encourage you to be faithful in your tithes and offerings. Just remember, if all Adventists were faithful in tithing, we'd have $1 billion more worldwide. And if you want some interesting research, this person that wrote the book, Passing the Plate, they started itemizing different things that the church could do. I mean, that would be hundreds of billions of dollars every year. You know, I think of the religious right in this country. They don't realize the power that they have. If they were turning that kind of money in, doing that type of thing, the government would be standing at their feet wanting them to help them. What's interesting is there'll come a time, I believe, when you will no longer be able to take advantage of a charitable deduction on your tax return for your contributions. It's going to change. They've tried over a dozen times to do away with that. Why? They say the charitable deduction is a loophole for the rich, and the people that really need it are not taking advantage of it. So what they'll do is they'll probably say, well, if you give to charity, if you give anything over $2,000, then you can deduct anything over a threshold. They're already doing that with other types of things. So what are we going to do? This country that we live in is the only country in the world that allows people to have charitable deductions for contributions. It's okay to use Christian ethics to take care of certain loopholes in the tax system, as long as you use Christian ethics. So where's your treasure? You know, there's 3 pockets. You have 3 pockets full of money. The first pocket is called earned income. The second one is called a capital pocket. That's like if you're building a gymnasium or building a new church, like this Sunnydale Academy Church. They have a major building project going on. That would be the capital pocket. The earned income pocket, that would be your tithes and offerings. And the third pocket is called the estate pocket. You and I, we work all of our life, and we have amassed amount of money, and then we come to that time of life and we have to leave it all behind. What do we do with that? And my friend Dave Lincoln helps church members with that, estate planning. Ellen White says, don't forget the Lord's work whenever you are remembering your family. Just remember. How about this? Have you ever seen an ugly baby? You've seen an ugly baby? If you have ever seen an ugly baby, don't say it. Just say, that's a baby. Well, what do babies have on when they come into this world? They have nothing. And they don't own anything. And what do they do all during their life? Some of them amass a lot of wealth. And who owns the wealth? So in reality, who should they give it back to? They ought to give it back to God. I practice what I preach. That's the way I've structured my estate plan. I was talking to a guy one day. He said, I've got to leave my son something. I'm going to leave him that Corvette out there. I said, well, could I be part of your family for a while? And I said, does your son need anything? Oh, no, he doesn't need anything. I said, what kind of car does he drive? He drives a Ferrari. Sometimes the worst thing you can do is leave a lot of money to your kids. Now, that may not sound very good because here in this country we have this thing. I got to leave something to my kids. The inheritance you ought to leave for your kids is an education so they can make a living. Use the money to take care of yourself. You're probably going to need it. Most of us baby boomers, we're going to need it. Stewardship is the crowning act of your estate plan. But I could talk about all those things. Let's move on. Here's 3 reasons people give. They believe in changing lives. Now, the greatest generation didn't believe it. They were just loyal. Boomers, we don't believe in total loyalty, but we still are doing it. Back about 5 years ago, the boomers controlled or were earning about 70% of the income of the United States. In 2016, the millennials earn 55% of the income in the United States. So how are we going to shift from the boomer generation to the millennials and then ultimately the Z generation? How are they going to pick up the gospel torch? Are they going to buy into this systematic way of giving? Boomers are still loyal enough that we will give, but millennials will say, what motivates me to give is if I can see a life that is changed. And sometimes when you return your tithe and offering, it goes to the conference, you say, well, that's got a big black hole there. I don't know where it's going. So I would ask you, what's the purpose of the tithe? You'll say, well, it's to pay the preacher. And I'll ask you again, what's the purpose of the tithe? And if we had a chance for give and take, you would eventually say, well, it is really to advance the gospel. And I would say, yes. Preachers like me and all the preachers here are irrelevant. We just get to go along for the ride. Tithing is not the source of income for a club of preachers. Don't let that be turned into such. But sometimes we run that risk. returning the tithe and offering is for the advancement of the gospel. So, how can you shorten the distance from the gift and the impact? It's called a baptism. To me, that is the advancement of the gospel in a very visible manner. So whenever you're talking to people and you're giving an offering, especially if you have a baptism on a particular Sabbath, just encourage your congregations. You know, when you return tithe and offering, this is the end result. You want to shorten the distance between the gift and the impact. That's a very visible way of saying what it goes for. Number 2, regard for leadership. Nowadays, it seems popular to poke leaders in the eye and knock them around in any organization. And the Adventist Church is no different. When I first started this job, one of my friends that I went to academy with, they sent me an email and said, okay, it's time for you to start answering the right questions. You got to do things right. Why do you teach wrong things? Do you ever teach something that's wrong? And I said, well, I've done that lots of times. You know what book has changed my theology more than anything else? 3 words: Steps to Christ. I'm human. I remember getting out of seminary and I would use the Hebrew. And one day at church, a lady came and she had her Hebrew Bible with her. So I quit using that so much in my church sermons. Regard for leadership. We need leaders. And we need strong leaders. We need faithful leaders. We need leaders that will pay attention. What would you do with a leader? Very first church I pastored, the head elder wasn't returning tithe, and the Sabbath school teacher was smoking. I'm just out of seminary and I thought, oh, good grief. I'm a preacher's kid. I've seen a lot. But I didn't have to deal with it. So what do? I don't necessarily believe in revolution. I believe in evolution. Make changes in your church slowly. You don't want to have a revolution in a local church. You get in trouble real quick. So I went to see the head elder. And I said, sir, I don't understand. I don't see any record here. And you're the daddy of this church. And he got defensive. He said, I could say 1 or 2 words and that whole congregation would follow me. And I said, well, that's okay. Just let them go. It'll be okay. But I said, it's not my job to tell you how much your tithe is. It's my responsibility as a spiritual leader that you're participating, especially as a head elder. And as in the next few months, our nominating committee is going to meet. And if there's no evidence there, I'm not going to be able to recommend you. It was pretty tense. It was a tense time with me and him and his wife for the rest of the time I was there. He started turning in $50. Back in 1978, you still couldn't live on $500 a month. But that's between him and God. So what did I do with the guy that was smoking, teaching the Sabbath school class? I took a little more direct approach. Somebody said, Pastor Matthews, this guy's smoking. I have no evidence. I can't go talk to somebody that I don't know. But one day, I actually saw him smoking. So I went to him and I said, you know, I don't know very much, but I just can't let you teach the Sabbath school lesson anymore. And he was gone. Never saw him again at that church. Somewhere, somebody else came and taught the Sabbath school lesson. I had 3 churches, so I couldn't be there for Sabbath school. I moved from that district. I'm at camp meeting. And this guy comes up. He said, Pastor Matthews, I quit smoking. He couldn't stop talking about it. That same camp meeting, the head elder And his wife came and said, Pastor Matthews, I wasn't even ordained yet. Intern, smart aleck. They said, we're so sorry that we have been acting the way we acted while you were there. We've changed our ways. We don't know what was happening to us. In that same church, the church treasurer would bring together the church financial report. It was beautiful. I couldn't understand how she did it because I knew she knew nothing about accounting. And I discovered that her husband was doing the church treasury's books, and he was not a member. And I thought, this is terrible. He's knowing all this personal stuff about all these giving. I was just distraught. I thought, I got two choices. Either take the books away or see if I can give him Bible studies. I figured out why the books looked so good, because he was an ex-Lutheran church treasurer. And nobody knew this except me. So I started giving him Bible studies. I'm fresh out of seminary. I think I'm doing real good. He's accepting all this mumbo jumbo I learned in seminary. The longer you're in ministry, you learn to boil things down to where people can understand things simply. And so I said to him one day, Will, we've finished our lessons, our studies. I said, why don't you surprise your wife and be baptized? Oh yeah, I'll do that. And then the conversation really turned serious. He said, you know what, John? This guy was old enough to be my father. I filled out my tithe check for the first time in many years. And he started to weep. Returning tithe is not a financial transaction. It's a spiritual experience. And the power of giving is a changed life. He actually turned out almost to be a better member than his wife, and we also made him the assistant treasurer. Fiscal responsibility. What's that? That means you make wise financial decisions. Wise financial decisions. Does your church board make wise financial decisions? I've been on church boards that make really funny decisions. I'm not going to tell you any stories because they happened here in this conference. 3 reasons people give. People have the money and continue to give, but religion is not the charity of choice. You may not like it, I don't like it, but we are in competition for people's tithes and offerings. Whenever you give, I guarantee you, your church members, they also give to other organizations. So here's a little bit more research. In the United States, there's a disconnect between faith and a person's money. This is very clearly illustrated in the Christian world, and I wondered if it happens in our church. So the giving in U.S. households, they give about 2.6. Catholics give about 1.5. 7% of Christians tithe. So where's this disconnect? Or what do I mean by disconnect? I mean by disconnect, nobody tells me about what I do with my money. It's a personal matter. As a matter of fact, it's more sensitive to talk about than sex in the pulpit. And I talk about it all the time. So here's the disconnect in the Adventist church. 92% of Adventists say they have a saving relationship with God, and 56% say they return tithe and offering. These are world statistics. There's a disconnect right there. So I ask you the question, does returning tithe have something to do with salvation? And people will say no. And people will say yes. And people will say no. And you've got your argument going. I'm going to paraphrase a quotation from Ellen White. She will say, you cannot buy your way into heaven, but you can buy your way out. You know how you buy your way out? By not returning a tithe, a faithful tithe. You return a faithful tithe and you give offerings. You're not buying your way in, but I'm going to tell you what God's going to do with that. The last slide. So why do some people not give? They don't understand giving. They are self-focused. Me first. That's our culture. I must wait until I have enough to give. They believe they have nothing of value to give to the world. I expect something in return. There is no place for Jesus in their life, in their heart. Those are some reasons they give. How about this? Here's myths. True or false? You ready to take a quiz? Christians do not possess the discretionary financial resources to give 10%. True? False, that's correct. I have to look at the answer just to make sure. Christians, in other words, the first one says, I don't have money to give. That's false. The next question, Christians subjectively believe they do not possess the discretionary financial. That's false. Christians do not perceive existing legitimate needs that their money could meet. That's false. Christians lack awareness their churches teach 10%. That's false. Everybody knows it. They just don't do it. I had a person tell me one time, said, well, I forgot to tithe. How do you forget? That's just a polite no. Christians don't give because suspicions of waste. That's true. Churches hold low expectations of giving. That's true. Does your church hold a low expectation of giving? If you don't ask, you will not have. Christians don't want to be responsible for giving to succeed. And that's true. You know, Americans are comfortable living in debt, but we do not like to pay debt off, and we do not like to pay somebody else's debt off. So when I would go to churches, I said to the local church board, I will never get you in debt. We will go on a cash basis. And most of the churches I went to were in debt. We would get them out of debt. And it seemed like all the churches I went to had to replace their roof. And I said to my wife, I got to stop going to these churches where they have roofs to be replaced, because as a preacher you get a reputation, and I didn't, I wanted to do something else besides replacing roofs. Giving is highly privatized in the United States. That's true. Giving is low because of situational, occasional giving versus consistent and routine. Here's something that's just staggering to me. You sit down in December and you decide, I am going to give X number of dollars in the coming year. So you've got to add up all your monthly income, and here's what I give, and I'm going to come up with a dollar figure. The better way is to come up with a percent. 10% tithe, 10% offering, and then you split up that offering. You make that decision in December in the privacy of your own home. Don't wait till some silver-tongued speaker gets up and talks you out of your credit cards at church. The research says that if you make that decision privately in your own home before the next year starts, you will give more routinely, more consistently, and you will not miss it, and you'll give more than if you just wait and make your decision when you go to church. Only one church that I ever pastored bought into this idea. It was Muscatine, Iowa. We had money. We didn't charge tuition. We didn't even talk about it. We didn't even talk about the church budget. It wasn't me. But the church board bought into the idea. And the money was there. We could shut down for a whole month, not even have church. And the money was still there. And I've gone to other churches. It was just the opposite. The percentage plan is the best. Members that decide an annual amount give the most. Then, if you decide a dollar amount, that's next. Decide a weekly amount, that's next. Decide what I can afford to, that's next. Part of American giving is the lack of planning. Plan your gifts. Plan your tithe and offerings. So how do I get there? You cannot deal with tithe and offerings until you deal with time in a person's life. If you're getting new people to become Seventh-day Adventists, they've got to deal with the Sabbath, and that's dealing with time. Then they're going to start thinking, how can I support this organization? My next door neighbor works for the United States government. His job is to teach Chinese judges and lawyers. They come over here and he teaches them about the American judicial system. Interesting man to talk to. So we got to talking about the political scene during the election. Neither one of us knew which one to vote for. Neither one of us realized we really didn't want to vote for either one. But we didn't talk about that too much, but he started talking about political contributions. And he said, whenever a person gives a political contribution, that means they support the concepts and the ideas of that particular political party. And the light went off. When you return tithe and offering, you support that organization's principles and what they stand for. If you give your tithe and offering to an independent ministry, you're supporting what they stand for. By the way, just so you'll remember, when the Seventh-day Adventist Church started, it was an independent ministry. But now we are a well-established organization, and we think we have to have these other independent ministries. And they do wonderful things. Sean does wonderful things, and he'll preach well. He preaches his heart out. He reaches people. But it is because of the organization that makes those organizations possible. Don't ever forget that. They cannot stand alone. They cannot fulfill the mission of the Adventist Church by themselves. Your local church cannot fill the mission. Congregational model cannot fill the mission of the church. We are a group that has a message, and we need to get people to rise above just the transaction of money to start giving some time. So I've heard people say, well, you ought to give 10% of your time to the organization. Well, how much? There's 24 hours in a day, 168 hours for a week. That'd be 28 hours or something like that. Would you like to give 28 hours of your life to the church? Wow, man, this place would be rocking. But no, we go to church for about an hour, maybe at the most 2 hours. But yet we'll watch television pretty much 40 hours a week. The average American does that. So you can't compete. So how do we get people involved? There are different kinds of advancing the kingdom. You have your tithe, your treasure, talent, but let's focus on time. Let's see if we can get people to volunteer. If you get people to volunteer in your church, pretty soon they will start putting some skin in the game. Those who volunteered scored better on 9 measures of emotional wellness. older adult volunteers had better physical and cognitive benefits to tutored in urban schools. When volunteering, older adults experience 40% lower risk of high blood pressure. Sounds pretty good. Better than a pill. Older adults who volunteered in an environmental stewardship program suffered less depression in later years. Volunteerism lowers mortality by 60%. If you volunteer, you will live longer. Tell church members, if you'll volunteer, come help cut the grass, come fix the plumbing, come volunteer and be part of it. You're going to live longer. My mother-in-law, who was 90-something years of age, she said, "John, this living longer is not worth it." I heard a joke one time, and it gave me a picture of my mother-in-law. She was very methodical, very faithful Adventist. I mean, she could catch mistakes when the bank made them on 2 or 3 cents, and she'd call them up and make them fix it. So the joke was, and we'd tease her about this, very straight-laced Seventh-day Adventist. She goes to the doctor for her checkup. The checkup is done. She's waiting in the waiting room. Her ride can't come. She finally goes outside. She's waiting. Ride still doesn't come. She sees a pizza place over there, and the people in the waiting room says, "Why don't you go over there and wait, because we're closing." She goes over to the pizza place. She's waiting, sitting there waiting. Ride doesn't come. She finally says to the pizza place, "I'd like a large order. Do you deliver?" "Yes." "I want to go with them." So when you're old and you get in those situations, just remember, go to the Pizza Hut. They'll take you home. Adolescents showed lower body mass index, inflammation, and cholesterol readings after volunteering for 10 weeks. We could spend more time on volunteering, but I want to share with you a story about giving. It's a personal story. So I go on a short-term mission trip to Livingstone, Zambia. I didn't want to go. Those people there marching, that symbolized they were marching to Zion. They were named the Crusaders. That was the name of my Pathfinder club when I was a kid. And they didn't get a picture, but I got in line with them doing that rhythm. And so here's my story. You see up there, I had a motorcycle, 225 Yamaha. I've had the Harley Davidsons and the big, long hair and all that kind of stuff. My wife had a small Suzuki. I had the idea of having lots of fun, but it would sit in my garage most of the time. And so I couldn't ever get it started. So I'd take it to the shop, spend $100 to get it started, and then it wouldn't run because the battery was dead. I'd spend another $100 almost every year. I'd ride up and down the street, and I hate wearing helmets. And then I'd put it back in the garage and let it sit there. Wasn't smart enough to buy a trickle charger to keep the battery up. I said to my wife, I'm going to sell it. And she said, okay, that's fine. And so I sold it. I paid $3,500 for it, and I sold it for $2,000. So it cost me $1,500, sitting in the garage most of the time. So I was driving down the road. I had $2,000 in $100 bills and fanned out in my hand, and I was fanning with it. This was down in Texas. I'm driving home, and God spoke to me in my car. He's never talked to me like this before. And sometimes I don't want him to talk to me about like it again. But he said, John, I want $1,500 of that, $2,000. Because I was wondering, what am I going to spend this money? I didn't have time to put it in my pocket. It was on fire already. But when God said, I want $1,500, I said, okay, it's yours. No more argument. The decision was made. He can have it. But I said, God, what do you want me to give it to? He said, I want you to buy something. I want you to give it to something that you cannot see. I said, but I'm an American. I want to know what it is. He said, okay, I'll tell you. I want you to buy a one-day church. You know what that is? So in Zambia, you can see the picture there of the head elder of a 400-member church that had never seen their pastor. You guys are lucky. Small churches and you see your pastor. You're lucky. Fortunate. It's an American phenomenon that every church has to have their pastor. He lived in a place called Ngwenya. And so you see a rock quarry there. They would hammer out rocks to the size of gravel to put on the road. You could buy a wheelbarrow full for $1. So there's what I bought. That was the church they assigned me to. 400 people. And those crusaders were responsible for getting 70 people baptized. And when I went over there, I'd listen to all the people talking about the other sites. And they said, those people in Ngwenya, if you're scared of the spirits, that's where you go. If you can't get a job, that's where you go. And John, you're a trust services guy and you don't preach very good, that's where you're going to go. I said, thank you very much. Low expectations. And there's the church that I bought. So I'm at that site. I've never seen it. I've just seen this picture. There's a guy walking around. There's a bulldozer or a road grader, and he's leveling everything. And I recognized him. He doesn't know who I am. I went up to him. I said, I just cost you $1,500. He said, that's all right, John. People cost me a lot of money. He said, you know what? These people in Ngwenya, they're really doing something. All the other sites, they're complaining and they're griping and this, but these people, they're just working away. I'm going to build a bigger one-day church. We're going to do a turnkey job. And we're going to build something for the youth. You can see a little bit of it to the side. He was so excited. He was drawing it out on a napkin, passing out candy to the kids. His last name was McNeilis. I could tell you more about the story. But back to my motorcycle. I was fanning with it. I said, Lord, can I fan with this till I get home? He said, okay. But don't push me, or I'll get the other 500. I said, okay. I do not know whatever I have done with that 500. But I will never forget where the 1,500 went. Martin Luther said, I've held a lot of things in my hands, and I've lost them, but whatever I've given to God, I still have. That story is still as fresh as when it happened. On the way home, I had tears in my eyes. Have you ever given an offering with tears in your eyes? That's what is called a cheerful giver. How do you get to be a cheerful giver? It starts out with gratitude. If you're not grateful, you'll never be generous. If you're not generous, you're never going to be cheerful, because there is a pretty big gap between generous and cheerful. What is it? The Bible says you need to bring an offering without spot or wrinkle, without any blemish. I don't have any goats. I don't have any sheep. I live in a money economy. How do I bring money to God without spot or blemish? The way I do it is by giving a sacrifice. And for some people, 10 plus 10 is a sacrifice just as much as that widow turned in 2 copper coins as a sacrifice. When she walked away, she had tears in her eyes when Jesus said to her, and she saw him and heard him say, you've given more than anybody else. So in order to be cheerful, you have to have gratitude, you have to be generous, and then when you make that offering, it's got to be a sacrifice. You try 10 plus 10 on a consistent basis. You'll have plenty of skin in the game. Then you try to encourage others to participate. And you'll see a revolution in your church. Booker T. Washington said, if you want to lift yourself up, lift up someone else. He's walking to work. A lady comes out on her porch and says, hey, come here and cut some logs and firewood for me. And Booker T. Washington takes off his jacket, cuts the wood, carries it in, stacks it up. And this lady's servant said, do you know who that is? That's the president of Tuskegee Institute. And she was so embarrassed, she went over to Tuskegee Institute and apologized and said, oh, I'm so sorry. He said, I don't mind giving of my time to help my friends. And some legends of this story says she became a major benefactor of Tuskegee Institute. But in the Adventist Church, we have the ability to revolutionize the world through our giving. I have this weird theology. If all Adventists were faithful in tithe, Jesus would come back. Because he's looking for a statement of faith on the earth. And that's what tithing and offering is. It's a statement of faith. Nobody in their right mind would give this kind of money away. Whenever you return your tithe and offering, it is a public statement in your personal experience that God exists. Why would you give something to somebody you can't see? Give it to the Music Society. Give it to the library. Give it to the museum. That's what the philanthropy wants you to do. But no, we are appealing to a higher power. We have a mission. We need to fund it. Ellen White says the money's there, but we're not bringing it all into the storehouse. We argue what the storehouse is. So how long you want to stay on earth? So the research says we have a sophisticated view of stewardship, but we're lost in the big picture. My time is gone, I think. I've got 5 minutes. So I'm going to go over this next few slides in 5 minutes. It's week number 10 of the Sabbath School Quarterly, so you're going to see it again sometime in January, February, and March. I want you to picture a wagon wheel. Here's the power of giving. A wagon wheel. For me, the axle is Christ. The axle on a wagon wheel carries the weight. Paul said, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Jesus is the living center of everything, Ellen White says in the book of Evangelism. He's the center. I've heard people say stewardship is the foundation of everything we believe, and I take issue with it. Maybe they're correct, maybe we're playing with semantics, but I think Jesus is the center. He's in my heart, in my brain. He's the center of my life. He's my everything. Paul said, for me to live is Christ. I don't know how to get to that point, but I'm trying to get there. So the axle is Christ. Then the hub. The hub of the wheel is usually made out of elm because it will not split. And this represents to me the sanctuary doctrine. So in my illustration, I have Christ in the sanctuary. Standing on sola scriptura principle, biblical Adventism builds its doctrinal system from the general perspective of the sanctuary doctrine. What is that sanctuary doctrine? What does it provide me? It provides me a unique lens to look through when I see the rest of the world philosophy. And if I don't have it, I become susceptible to everything that we get. And that doctrine has been challenged, knocked around. People do all kinds of things to it. We haven't internalized it and made it a lens that I can look through. And then that takes me, listen at this. This is Ellen White saying, the sacrifice of Christ as the atonement for sin is the greatest truth around which all other truths cluster. So that brings me to the spokes of this wheel. And the spokes represent all the different ideas, doctrines, beliefs, and attitudes and things that I believe. For example, the state of the dead, tithing, kindness, the food we eat, salvation, the Trinity, the mark of the beast, the law, the Sabbath, kill, lie, other gods, all those different things that I believe, even my values on how I react to my family, those form the spokes. They must be anchored in the sanctuary, connected to Christ, or you're no different than anybody else. Can you preach the gospel? Can you explain the gospel as it is set in the sanctuary, the plan of salvation that's different than any other way you hear it on the radio or television? What do we have to offer? You say, what has this got to do with stewardship? Well, Christ has everything to do with stewardship. Being a steward, the sanctuary, that's the lens that a steward works through. And I'm building a system. Stewardship is a system. And you'll see how this all fits together. There's an interesting fact about the wheel. This wheel that went across the prairie, Nebraska, the Oregon Trail, carries this heavy wagon. The wheel was invented about 3500 BC, but it's specifically a human invention. There's nothing in the world of nature that makes the wheel. And the wheel for that prairie schooner or that covered wagon is the most refined exhibit of a wheel that ever has existed. It takes a real craftsman or craftsperson to build one. They've got to have a little blacksmith ability. They've got to be able to woodwork. And how they put that wheel together will determine how it's going to survive. They call it the wheelwright. And for me, God is the wheelwright. Little girl went for a walk and got lost out in the prairie. The grass was tall. She said, I got to go home. She couldn't find her way home. So the town organized a search party. And this big farmer, he saw a little head bobbing up and down, up and down, up and down. And he got there and she jumped up in his arms and said, I knew you would come. I knew you would come. He said, how did you know I would come? Well, I prayed to Jesus that you would come. And he said, well, it sounded to me like you were saying your ABCs. She said, but I was letting Jesus put them together the way he wanted to. That's a system. And that's what this wheel represents. All these different ideas are like the ABCs of what I believe, and they're anchored in Christ. But what's interesting, about this wheel is if you just have the spokes straight and it goes fast and turns, it'll fall apart. The Romans figured out if they dish the spokes, and you can see a sample of it, put them at an angle, they will act as a brace for this wheel, and when the chariot is going fast and it turns, it won't fall apart. So the beliefs that you and I have act as a brace for our theology that's anchored in Christ. And then that takes me to the rim. The Old English word is called Pheli. The rim is a three angels' message for mission. You and I are in a church that is not static. It is not supposed to be static. If it is static, it's on the way down. And when I say our church should not be static, I'm not saying we should always be in a church fight. That's not the type of static I'm referring to. We need to be moving forward about God's business. That rim fastens this entire system of beliefs and the sanctuary doctrine for mission. Then there's the tire. The tire is stewardship. What do I mean? The text there in Proverbs, when the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. When your stewardship is right and your theology is right, the wheel will roll and people in the community around you will see what God has done for you. There was an old preacher named Willis Hackett. Have you ever heard of him? He grew up in a little tiny town. Some Adventists moved to town, and back in those days, they'd get groceries, and you wouldn't necessarily pay every time you got groceries. You'd pay whenever you got the money. But the Adventist family moved on. And the store owner took a liking to Willis Hackett's dad. He tried to get me to be a Seventh-day Adventist. He would talk to him and never would do anything. So Willis Hackett's an old man. He goes back to that childhood store. He says, is so-and-so here? He said, yeah, my dad's there in the back room. And he goes back and he says to this old guy, he said, I'm Willis Hackett, that little kid. Oh, yes, I remember your dad. He said, you know why I'm not an Adventist? Because that family moved away and left a big bill. And I would tell your dad all about it and complain, what kind of religious people are you? And every time your dad would come in, he'd take money out and pay those groceries off. But I never could get past that. So how do people see what you do? That's what that's talking about. When the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. Based on your concept of a whole life of stewardship, managing all those intangibles and those tangible possessions. The cities look at you, the people look at you, and they see what you do. Stewardship is about what you do. And you trace it back to Christ as the axle of the wheel is who you are. That's why He gives you purpose. He drives the values. The values drive the goals. The goals drive time, and the time drives money, because in this wheel, there's a common denominator of everything, and that's money. Every line of Christian experience and labor is to be a representation of the life of Christ. So there's some outcomes. What's an outcome? Godliness is one. There are three men in the Bible that are referred to as godly: Noah, Daniel, and Job. Noah was considered insane. Daniel was willing to die for his belief. And Job suffered intense suffering. But they were godly men. So there's the outcomes: godliness, contentment, trust, influence. This is when a person has their act together and they are happy with their relationship with Jesus, and they're faithful and they're honest with God, and they're systematically putting skin in the game. And one day, God's going to say two phrases. He's going to say, well done. And he's going to say, depart from me. Which one would you like to hear? Have you ever heard somebody say to you, well done, you did a good job? You know, growing up in the Deep South, I could not read or write very well, nor could I spell. When I was in the 8th grade, they said, what do you want to be? Write it down on a piece of paper. I spelled it P-A-S-T-U-R-E-D. Wanted to be a pastor. The 8th grade teacher had a few chuckles, but I finally learned how to spell that word. I got to college on academic probation. Barely got out of college. I got to seminary on academic probation. I barely got out of seminary. I thought, man, some church is really going to be lucky to have me as their pastor, knowing my intellectual acumen. So I went to pastor churches, and some churches I stepped in every mud puddle that existed. You know what a mud puddle is in a church? If you don't, and you recognize what if you see it, just stay out of it. It'll be a fight. Or if you see a big hunk of money sitting on the local treasury books, you better leave it alone. You start spending that, it's going to be a fight. So I learned. I thought, my lands, if pastoring is going to be like this, I need some more education. And so I was in the Deep South. And the conference says we don't send our pastors to further their education other than the masters. And I got a letter from the Mid-America Union. They said, we're paying people to get their doctorate. And that's how I ended up out here in Iowa, Missouri. I wanted to better myself. So I was one of the first waves that went through the doctoral program offered by Andrews University. And I wanted it so bad, I said to myself, I'd rather die than give this up. And it's there I began to learn to talk a little better. You can still hear my southern accent. But in the Midwest, they have companies, telemarketing companies, because they don't have an accent. Can you imagine picking up the phone and talking to a telemarketer and say, how you doing today? Would you like to buy a magazine? You know, you wonder if would that person have a brain? I began to learn how to read a little better, how to study, how to spell. I still have trouble with all that. So for me to have an opportunity to write a Sabbath School Quarterly, it's really more a miracle than anything else. And I give God the glory for that privilege. But I wrote this dissertation, and I never studied so hard and wrote so much to prove so little. And I said to myself, if I ever see this again, it'll be too soon. So it's sitting up there on the shelf somewhere at Andrews Library. But I go to the graduation day, and my major professor hugs me, and he shakes my hand. He messes with the tassel. He says, John, well done. I'll never forget that. I know both sides of the academic arena, and well done is much better than the other side. But it pales into comparison to when Jesus says, well done. Do you know when he's going to say that? Listen to this. I don't understand how this is going to happen. I just don't understand. I guess I haven't thought about it long enough. When Christ's followers give back to the Lord his own, that's the tithe. It's his. When Christ's followers give back to the Lord his own, they are accumulating treasure which will be given to them when they shall hear the words, well done. How's that going to be? The doors are open. Angels on this side, angels on that side, they're singing. We come walking in and we start singing the same song, and the angels say, how in the world did you learn that song? We'll say, we lived it. Because stewardship is living what you believe. And the better you live what you believe, the happier you are. It has nothing to do with works. A steward is just good at what they do. There's good stewards. Joseph, he was a good steward. He was good at what he did. He wasn't trying to work his way to anywhere. He lived what he believed. So we start singing, and we say, well, we lived it. And Jesus says, wait just a minute, everybody. Wait. This is the part I don't understand, but that's what that says. He's going to say, here's your tithe, and here's your offering back. Do you know what the interest rate is of heaven? 100-fold. That's 10,000%. Oh, and eternal life. Doesn't get any better than that. Let's pray. Father in heaven, help us to be ready when you come. And while we wait for your second coming, help us to live what we believe. In Jesus' name, amen.